Good morning, everybody. Today we're just going to go over the problems that I had posted for you yesterday. And the goal for the week's worth of, we'll call it class work participation, will be having submitted these answers to me and also at least 2 hours of Khan Academy this week. I'll be looking for that later. Let's say I'll look for it on Saturday. So I'll give you throughout the end of the day tomorrow to catch up on your 2 hours of Khan for the week. All right, the first question you had to answer was number 31. It said, according to a recent currency exchange rate, $1 US can purchase 14.9 Mexican pesos or 62.2 Indian rupees. Using this information, determine how many Indian rupees can be purchased with 1 Mexican peso, round to the nearest hundredth. All right, well, I'm going to write down the information that I think is important. So we have the US to the Mexico ratio of 1 to 14.9. We also have the US to the Indian rupee ratio of 1 to, 62.2. Now, if $1 US is equal to both 14.9 pesos and 62.2 rupees, that basically tells us that we have a ratio here of Mexican pesos to Indian rupees of 14.9 to 62.2. That helps us answer the question, because now the question is, how many rupees does 1 peso buy? So I'm going to set this equal to 1 peso over X rupees. And now that we have it set to a proportion, we know how to solve with cross products. So 62.2 times 1 is still 62.2. And 14.9 times X is 14.9X. Divide both sides by 14.9. We get an answer rounded to the nearest hundredth of 4.17. And that's the answer. Again, you want to set your proportion that they're giving you to the new problem to solve. So we have pesos to rupees, and then again, how many rupees does 1 peso buy? This is the best way to solve it, in my opinion, and that's number 31. Moving on to number 32. This one wasn't that difficult. They gave you some information that you really didn't need. It told you there's 900 students in a certain district. It's kind of irrelevant, because they're then going on to say that there's 175 in elementary school. The question is, and 100 of them get an allowance. The question said, given that we've chosen an elementary school student, what's the probability they have an allowance? To be honest, again, the 900 students in the district is kind of irrelevant, because out of the 175 elementary students, 100 have an allowance, and that is 0.57. There's your answer. If you wanted to reduce the fraction, you could have done that as well. I think it's 4/7. But 0.57 is a good answer. You make sure you don't write just the number 57. It's 0.57 because it's probability. And that answer is number 32. Without much stress, on to 33. They gave you this function. They said g of x equals parenthesis x minus 1/2 squared. Hopefully at this point we realize that is a parabola. And it's not very transformed either. It just has moved 1/2 step to the right on the x-axis. If you wanted to sketch it, you certainly could. It's not a problem. If that's the number 1, I'm going to call that 1/2. That's my new vertex. And there's my parabola. No problem. It then also told us that the x-intercept was n0. The x-intercept is the place on the x-axis where the parabola crosses through. We already see it's right there. So what is n? Well, n is 1/2. The y-intercept, they tell you, is the coordinate 0b. Now that's a little harder because we don't have that handed to us, but we could certainly solve for it. Hopefully we understand the y-intercept happens when x is 0. So I'm just going to take my equation here and see what happens when x is 0. So what's g of 0? 0 minus a half squared. So g of 0 is a fourth. Okay, well that means that that number right there is a fourth. That's what b equals. The question is, what is n times b going to be? So it's 1/2 times 1/4, and that is 1/8, which is fine. Or you could write 0.125, which is also fine. They're both good answers, and that's it. All right, take a moment, look at the answer, make sure you got it, and we'll move on to number 34. '34 gave us a question about a pool that is filling at a rate of 4 gallons per minute. Okay, so it fills at 4 gallons per minute. All right, now, at noon, they say the pool is 6/25 full. That is 24%. 6 divided by 25 is 0.24. They tell you at 3:30, we now have a total of 40% filled. The question is, how much water will the pool hold? Well, 3:30 is 3.5 hours afternoon. And we know it fills at 4 gallons per minute, so what's 3.5 hours as minutes? Well, we multiply by 60. And then in the same little step, we can also multiply by the 4 gallons to find out how many gallons have entered the pool over the course of those 3.5 hours. What do you get? Well, we get 840 gallons. Now, that's not the answer. We're just finding out right now that 840 gallons has entered the pool over the course of those 3.5 hours. But what we notice here is that 16% of the pool has been filled over the course of those 3.5 hours. So make an equation for yourself. 840 gallons is 16% of what? And that's going to give you the answer for how much the pool can hold. Divide by 0.16, you find it's a rather large pool at 5,250 gallons. All right, 5,250. Again, the steps are in front of you. We figured out again over the course of those 3.5 hours, it went up 16% of its capacity. 3.5 hours times 60 minutes times 4 gallons a minute was 840 gallons. That's what it gained over the course of those 3.5 hours. So 840 gallons is 16% of the pool's capacity, which is the variable here. We solve and we find 5,250 gallons. That's 34. '35 gave you two equations. It's a systems problem. 4y minus 2x equals 7. Also, we have ax plus 5y equals 10. They wanted to know what a would be if the two lines are perpendicular. What's a? Well, again, we have to figure out first what it means to be perpendicular. Hopefully we remember. Perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slope. All right. Oh, what's the slope? Well, I got to put this in slope-intercept form. Add 2x to both sides. Divide by 4. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. The important thing here is that the slope is 1/2. If I need perpendicular lines, then the perpendicular slope to a slope of 1/2 is the opposite reciprocal. So the perpendicular slope has to be negative 2. Okay, well, this has to now be put into slope-intercept form. So I'm going to subtract ax from both sides. I'll do that over here. We got 5y equals negative ax plus 10. And I'm going to divide everything by 5. So we get negative 1/5 ax plus 2. Again, I don't really care about the y-intercept. I'm concerned more about the slope. I know that the slope of this line has got to be negative 2. The slope of this line is negative 1/5 a. So negative 1/5 a has got to be negative 2. Otherwise, they would not be perpendicular lines. I have a negative fractional coefficient. I'm going to multiply both sides by the negative to cancel the negative, and 5 to cancel the denominator. A equals 10. There's your answer. Nothing else to do there. A equals 10. Take a look at it. Make sure you got it. Tell me if you have any questions in an email or the comment field. Moving on to our last problem of the day. We're given that there's a line out there. It's got endpoints of 1, 3, and x5, and the distance between them is a length of 6. We have to know what is the x-coordinate. Well, hopefully, I say hopefully, you remember the distance formula. But you might not, so here it is. The distance between two coordinates is the square root of the difference of the x's squared plus the difference of the y's squared. I know we've talked about it before. It's akin to the Pythagorean Theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Very similar, but you have to know the distance formula to solve this problem. The distance here was 6. And I'm going to go x minus 1 squared plus 5 minus 3 squared. Okay, so we have under the square root here, I'm going to expand that. X minus 1 squared is x squared minus 2x plus 1. If you FOIL it out, you'll see that's what you get. If you can't just do that in your head, then by all means, expand it and FOIL. 5 minus 3 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. I'm going to square both sides to get rid of the radical. So I have 36 equals x squared minus 2x plus 5. I obviously combine the 4 and the 1. I'm going to subtract 36 because this is quadratic. So x squared minus 2x minus 31 equals 0. It does not factor. You also should have known that in the first place because the question says round the answer to the nearest, I think it was 100th. Well, if it were factorable, you wouldn't have to. How do we solve? The quadratic formula. What a long question. X equals negative b. Well, that's positive 2. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. That's negative 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, c, which is negative 31, all over 2a, which is 2. All right, I'll show you if you want. 2 times 1. Please don't forget the quadratic formula, kind of an important thing. So x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 124 over 2. That's 2 plus or minus the square root of 128 over 2. 128 is not a perfect square. However, if you take the square root, you can round it to the nearest, let's say, 10th place, because we got to round to the nearest whole number, actually. 11.2 is what you get. 2 plus or minus 11.2 over 2. Now, at this point, I have two things to solve for, but not really. Distance can't be negative. I know that. 2 minus 11.2 is a negative value. I don't need to solve for it. I know it's extraneous. I know it's not going to work. Distances can't be negative. So I'm only going to worry about the positive. So it's 2 plus 11.2 over 2, which is 13.2 over 2, which rounds to approximately 7. That's your answer. It said round to the nearest whole number. It was 6.6 something. So the answer is 7. Those are all the questions answered for you. I hope that you were able to solve them yourself as well. If you have any questions, you have to let me know. You also need to, again, do the work every day. This was a homework assignment, and I didn't receive it from many people. Pretty much just one person. This is going to reflect negatively because this is a homework assignment. Please get it done. Now, I've done all of them for you. If you go to the effort of writing down every single step from what I just showed you on paper and submitting it as your homework, so be it. At least you've written it down. But in the future, full credit will only be awarded if you submit the answers to me before I submit them to you. That makes sense? I think so. All right, again, there's no extra homework tonight. All I really want you to do is make sure you've got at least 2 hours of Khan Academy for the week. And if you already have that, you're good to go. If you've done all the homeworks, there are, I think, are now 3 that I entered. You're fine. If you did not do them all, get them done, submit them to me, and be more timely in the future. Have a great day.